All right, welcome to This Explainer. We are jumping right into an absolutely epic journey today. We're diving into over 6 million years of history here, tracing humanity's incredible evolution from scattered, floating atoms in the proverbial petri dish of the world, all the way to our highly interconnected modern global societies. We're going to really unpack the mechanisms of civilization, how we survived, how we conquered, and how we actually organized ourselves across the millennia.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for The Explainer. We're breaking down human history into 5 massive epochs: the birth of the first civilizations, the age of empires, philosophy, faith, and order, the medieval global shift, and finally, rebirth and revolution. Let's get into it.
So, let's fast forward just a bit. We're skipping from the emergence of the very first hominids over 6 million years ago, past the cold-adapted Neanderthals, right up to a pivotal moment, right around 4000 BCE. This is when Homo sapiens in Mesopotamia, specifically the Sumerian city of Uruk, finally figured out how to harvest cereal grains, and boom, that kicks off the agricultural revolution.
Which brings us to Epoch 1, the birth of first civilizations. Humanity crossed a huge threshold here. We officially traded in a life of nomadic hunting and gathering for rooted, organized, and highly complex farming communities. But it took a staggering physical toll. You'd think inventing a reliable food source would instantly make us healthier, right? Well, actually, in Iraq, humans traded their nomadic, super-athlete physiques for grueling, repetitive farm labor. It was so intense that the average height of men drastically shrank from 5'9" down to literally 5'3". So we became smaller, we were landlocked, but man, were we incredibly productive.
And with all that productivity came some pretty strict, repetitive class structures. Think about the Egyptian social pyramid. Society was entirely engineered to serve one person at the very top, the immortal pharaoh, who acted as a mediator with the gods. Every single layer below that, from the bureaucrats managing all the logistics down to the peasants and slaves, existed just to support the elite. It was those folks at the very bottom who literally spent their off-seasons doing the back-breaking manual labor to build the Great Pyramids.
But what's really fascinating is that while these civilizations were evolving at the same time, their priorities were wildly different. Consider the contrast. Ancient Egypt was entirely consumed with the afterlife, right? They were totally obsessed with immortalizing pharaohs through mummification and massive stone monuments. Meanwhile, over in modern-day Pakistan, the Indus Valley civilization had a completely different focus. They prioritized the living. They actually invented highly advanced underground plumbing, complete with flushable toilets and covered drains, just to keep their cities clean and hygienic. Talk about a difference in ancient priorities.
Moving right along to Epoch 2, the age of empires. So, as these early cities boomed, populations absolutely exploded, and that demanded strict laws, heavily organized power structures, and serious military might, just to maintain order and expand borders. Take the number 282, for instance. Back in 1772 BCE, a Babylonian king named Hammurabi etched exactly 282 strict laws onto a massive 7-foot stone slab. And this completely shatters any modern illusion you might have about ancient equality. These laws made it crystal clear that your worth was entirely based on your social class. The penalty for breaking a noble's bone was way more severe than breaking the bone of a slave. It was an incredibly harsh, rigid system.
And that rigid order totally fueled the violent rise and clash of massive empires. You had expansionists like the Hittites uniting in modern-day Turkey, who eventually collided with Egypt's Ramesses II at the notoriously bloody Battle of Kadesh. But here's the amazing part. After this grueling battle that essentially ended in a draw, these two warring empires had a realization. Peace was actually more profitable than war. So in 1258 BCE, they signed the world's very first recorded peace treaty. This kicked off an incredible era of shared agricultural and metallurgical knowledge.
Now let's look at 2 dominant Greek city-states that emerged a bit later on. On one side you have Sparta. This was a brutal, heavily militaristic society where unhealthy infants were discarded and young boys were taken from their families just to train endlessly for war. Then, on the flip side, you have Athens. This was a wild experiment in early democracy that was messy, loud, and incredibly chaotic. You'd literally have tens of thousands of citizens showing up to the assembly to yell and vote on laws and generals.
So how did they manage all that democratic chaos? Well, the Athenians invented an amazing piece of ancient technology called the claritarion. It was this bizarre but brilliant sortition machine. It used a whole system of tubes and balls to randomly select tokens. And that is exactly how they chose the members of their ruling council of 500. It was completely randomized. The whole point was to prevent any wealthy aristocrat from using bias or outright bribery to buy their way into power. Pretty clever, right?
All right, on to Epoch 3, Philosophy, Faith, and Order.
As these empires, like Rome, the Persians, the Chinese dynasties, got way too massive and diverse for just swords and walls to control them, leaders needed something deeper. Humanity desperately sought profound intellectual and spiritual meaning to act as a kind of social glue. In the East, they developed incredibly powerful concepts to maintain order. The Zhou dynasty championed the mandate of heaven, this idea that heaven itself grants a virtuous emperor the absolute right to rule. But if that ruler becomes corrupt, heaven sends droughts or earthquakes as a literal sign to replace them. Combined with Confucian Li, which emphasized deep social customs, respect, and duty, this philosophy brilliantly justified the ruling class while keeping massive populations of hardworking farmers peaceful and productive. Meanwhile, over in the West, the great Greek philosopher Plato was violently opposed to the chaotic, random democracy of Athens. He argued, look, you wouldn't let a randomly selected passenger steer a ship, right? So why on earth would you let a random citizen steer a state? He believed society needed a wise, highly educated philosopher king holding the reins of power. It's a really fascinating debate that honestly still echoes today. Who is actually fit to lead? But it wasn't just philosophy. Faith became this incredibly powerful global unifier. Think about the massive ripple effects happening all over the world. Siddhartha Gautama steps outside his wealthy palace, witnesses suffering for the first time, and achieves enlightenment, founding Buddhism. This eventually influences the Indian conqueror Ashoka the Great to abandon violence entirely. Over in the West, a child named Jesus is born during a mandatory Roman census. His later crucifixion under Roman law sparks Christianity, a faith that eventually takes over the very empire that executed him. Centuries later, Muhammad receives revelations and rapidly unites the warring tribes of the Arabian Peninsula under Islam. These faiths provided vital common ground for millions of people.
Which brings us to Epoch 4, the medieval global shift.
This is a dramatic global pivot point. The Western world essentially stumbles into darkness, while the East surges forward in remarkable knowledge, wealth, and conquest. Tracking this macro shift, we see the absolute collapse of Western Rome in 476 AD at the hands of Germanic tribes. This plunges Europe into centuries of turmoil, political fragmentation, and vulnerability. Meanwhile, massive new powers are rising elsewhere, leading to explosive encounters, like the Arab expansion halted at the Battle of Tours, and eventually the terrifying unification of the Mongol tribes under Genghis Khan. You really have to see the contrast between East and West during this time, because it is literally mind-blowing. While Europe was enduring terrifying Viking raids and retreating into a rigid, survival-based system of feudalism just to stay alive, the global East was experiencing a renaissance of its own. During the Islamic Golden Age, Baghdad built the House of Wisdom, giving the world algebra. And over in India, mathematicians were making groundbreaking discoveries, like utilizing the concept of zero and successfully calculating the circumference of the Earth. No big deal, right?
And the sheer dominance of the East, it's perfectly captured by this one staggering statistic. Genghis Khan united 1 million people and swept across the continent with such brutal efficiency that roughly 8% of all South Asian men alive today share his direct DNA. That is wild. It's a striking reminder of how deeply ancient conquests are literally coded into our modern world.
Finally, we hit Epoch 5, Rebirth and Revolution.
So in this final era, humanity finally starts pushing back against the absolute power of kings and the church, demanding individual rights. But let's be real, political realities remained incredibly harsh. While the Renaissance was producing breathtaking cultural achievements, think Michelangelo's David or Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, thinkers like Niccolo Machiavelli were coldly reminding rulers of a basic historical truth. Because humans can be inherently selfish, elite control is best maintained through fear. It completely explains why generations of peasants handed over their crops to lords. They were terrified of what external forces like the Huns or Mongols would do to them without their lord's protection.
But you know, fear couldn't hold back human progress forever. The pushback was immense. Over in England, barons literally forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, demanding fair trials and due process. In a grim twist of fate, the devastating bubonic plague killed so many people that elites were actually forced to grant the surviving workers better rights just to keep the farms running. Then you have Martin Luther, courageously shattering the Catholic Church's absolute monopoly on faith with his 95 Theses. And the horrific 30 Years' War? It eventually resulted in the Peace of Westphalia, which laid the groundwork for the independent nations we recognize today.
And this centuries-long ideological shift toward individual rights finally culminated in events like the American Revolution.
The bold declaration that all men are created equal represented a fundamental tectonic shift in the human narrative. The paradigm completely flipped. Instead of subjects existing simply to build pyramids for immortal pharaohs or to serve vast empires, the idea finally emerged that governments exist to serve the people.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, looking back at this wild 6 million-year journey of survival, civilization, and revolution, we're left with a massive question to ponder. We've evolved from primitive agriculture all the way to fighting for inalienable rights. Looking forward, what fundamental desire or technological leap is going to drive humanity's next great era? Keep that in mind as you look at the world today. Thanks for joining me on this journey, and keep exploring.